started a long time ago on Capitol Hill. In 1960, all of the United or Methodist churches at the time, because their attendance was so low, merged to form the Capitol Hill United Methodist Church. 25 years ago, the congregation saw itself as engaged in the community. That engagement consisted of doing Christmas stockings for needy families, passing out sandwiches one Sunday a month in front of the church after service. And they had one office for an ecumenical community ministry where the executive director had an office in the building. And they let the homeless sleep on the church steps under the eaves. That was the community involvement. The only real engagement between the congregation and the community, other than passing out sandwiches once a month, was to sometimes step across them as they were leaving a church meeting. A new pastor was appointed. And in the process of getting to know the congregation, getting to know the community, visiting the stores, the bars up and down Pennsylvania Avenue, meeting with fellow pastors on Capitol Hill, he got to know those who slept around the church and asked them if he could spend the night on the street with them. The self-appointed mayor of those who slept around the church said yes, but with these two conditions. Once you come out of the church, you can't go back in until morning. And two, you have to allow us to provide you with the blankets and food and drink during the night. The pastor reports that he passed on the food and drinks, but he accepted the blankets because it was the beginning of Lent in February. And it was very cold. During that night, 2 fights occurred. The police showed up once. An irate neighbor had called, and in the morning called the church office to get the phone numbers of all the church leaders and began to call them, complaining that the pastor, the only white guy out there, was encouraging homelessness and tolerating violence. Turmoil in the congregation. The response of the Social Action Committee, all laity, was to begin having every Sunday a sit-down meal in which they would not only serve it, but sit down with those who came to eat so that they could come to get to know their unhoused neighbors. The pastor, while there, did a disciple Bible study every year. More people got involved in ministries, but even more people left the church. The pastor reported later to colleagues, it was the lowest point in my ministerial career. After church meetings, I would go to my office and sit for up to an hour in the dark. I want to be here, but it seems as though nothing is happening. People are leaving, not coming. It was a spiritual crisis. He reported that it meant for me, I can't do this alone. I can't do this without God. A time of renewal, but a time of great disappointment and frustration. That's how it started. I think it's important to know that what comes with expanding new ministries, what we can expect is disappointment and failure. There have been 4 pastors since that pastor slept on the street. It is the laity that have carried and expanded the ministry in that church. The takeaways I would suggest are that, 1, getting to know the community. Secondly, give people opportunities to become and to grow as disciples of Christ. And depend on God and not on yourself to get the vision, to provide the accurate words and all that you think you can do alone. Get to know the community, give people opportunities to grow as disciples of Christ, and depend on God to not only lead, but to sustain. This is about nonprofit partnerships. Excuse me, I'm doing 2 things at once. You may hear that. I'd like to say a few words about a for-profit partnership, which also occurred in Washington, D.C. Mount Vernon Place United Methodist Church was the national church for the Methodist Episcopal Church South. It's a huge building, downtown Washington. During and after World War II, they would have 1,600 in worship, one of the largest worshiping congregations in DC. But in 2004, there were 37 people worshiping. 35 of those were over 70. A new pastor was appointed there. Most of those 35 people were certain that she was appointed to close the church. She began to explore development possibilities for the property for commercial use. A local developer presented a plan to renovate the church, tear down 2 enormous educational buildings, and reluctantly, those 35 people approved the project. The developer went out of business, and that project was sold to a private equity company. Big disappointment, great uncertainty. That private equity company sold it to yet another private equity company. Delay, disappointment, frustration. But the second private equity company, after a very fiery meeting with the pastor, who said to them, "You cannot delay this project, my members will be dead," sold the project back before nightfall. Eventually, that project was completed. And that what happened was the development was for profit. The church got money in order to renovate the original building, also to set up an endowment. In this case, and now that congregation before COVID was worshiping 150. 80% of them were between the ages of 25 and 55. Some of those who voted to do the project did not live to see it completed, but others saw new people coming into the congregation. Again, frustration, despair, encouragement, dependency upon God to lead and to sustain, and hard work. The takeaways in this case, I think, is important to get to know the congregation and care deeply about their commitment. And secondly, to paint a vision a vision that's rooted in the commitment of those who have gone before. In every case, I believe that most of our Methodist churches have in some ways served in the Western tradition of not only having personal piety, but engagement in the community for the benefit of God's kingdom. So again, they began with frustration, a vision, patience, prayer. Partnerships are a key to developing a web of ministry. There are others who share the commitment to serve others, and many of them do it much better than we do in the church. And so to develop and build partnerships is really building for the future. And I think the other thing that's important to say is that it is really dependent on lay engagement, because those who are laity have a much broader and wider influence than we do as pastors, and can extend the ministry of the church in ways that is hard to measure. So lay engagement means that even if you as a pastor move on, then the ministries can continue and will continue. So with that, I'd like to ask if you have any questions about this. My primary purpose here is to let you know that beginnings are often involve stumbling, learning, and almost always do not become successful without totally dependent on God. So, any questions that you may have? You can, Annabelle, if you would send out the web pages for these two congregations, and there also, I think we have there, there's a book written by the pastor who did the Mount Vernon place that you might want to do some follow-up. I think simply looking at the web pages of the churches and of the 501c3s gives you an impression, or actually really reveals what is going on in those churches. And in all of them, there is a real dependency for ministry in utilizing and maximizing partnerships within the community.